They never thought I'd actually go through with it. And I did. My name doesn't matter right now. What matters is that on the morning of September 14th, I stood at the top of a staircase in a rented venue in Niagara-on-the-Lake, wearing a dress my mother had never seen, holding flowers my father had never approved, waiting to walk toward the man my family had spent 2 years trying to talk me out of marrying. And the 2 seats in the front row, the ones I had reserved, the ones with their names on little cream cards in my own handwriting, were empty. They kept their word. I kept mine. Let me go back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without context. My partner, Daniel, and I got engaged in October 2 years ago. We had been together for 4 years by then. He proposed at a small restaurant in downtown Toronto, just the 2 of us, a Tuesday night, completely unannounced. I said yes, before he finished the sentence. We called my parents that same night, on speaker, sitting in his car outside the restaurant. My mother cried. My father said he was proud. My younger sister, Natalie, texted me a string of heart emojis and asked if she could be in the wedding party. For about 3 weeks, everything was wonderful. Then we set the date. Daniel and I had been very deliberate about this. We wanted a September wedding because Ontario in September is genuinely beautiful, warm enough, not humid, the leaves just starting to turn. We wanted Niagara-on-the-Lake specifically, because his grandmother had been married there in 1967, and she had passed away the year before we got engaged. It felt meaningful. We booked the venue in November, 11 months before the wedding. We put down a non-refundable deposit of $8,500. The date was locked. Everything was moving forward. I called my mother to share the news. September 14th, Niagara-on-the-Lake. She went quiet for a second and then said, "Oh, just that. Oh." I asked her what was wrong. She said she'd have to talk to my father. 2 days later, my father called me. He sounded measured, the way he always does when he has already decided something, and is now presenting it to me as a discussion. He said that Natalie had booked a trip, a 2-week trip to Portugal and Spain with her boyfriend and a group of friends. The trip was scheduled for the 2nd and 3rd weeks of September, and the trip, according to my father, had already been paid for. I waited for him to say what he actually wanted. He said it would mean a lot to the family if I could consider moving the wedding date. I asked him to repeat that. He repeated it. I told him, as calmly as I could, that we had already signed a venue contract, that we had paid $8,500, that we would not get back, that we had already told Daniel's family, who were flying in from Calgary, that we had sent save the dates. My father said he understood that, but family had to come first. I said, Natalie can change her trip. He said Natalie's flights were non-refundable. I said, so are our deposits. He said that was different. I want to pause here and explain something about my family dynamic, because I think it matters. Natalie is 3 years younger than me. She is, and has always been, the easier child. Not smarter, not kinder, not more successful, just easier. She never pushed back. She never asked hard questions. She went to the university my parents suggested, studied what they thought was practical, dated men they approved of immediately. I took a different path. I moved to Toronto at 22 when they wanted me to stay in Kitchener. I changed careers once. I dated Daniel for a year before I even introduced him, because I needed to know it was real before I handed it to them to evaluate. This had always created a low-level friction that neither side ever fully acknowledged. Natalie's trip versus my wedding was not really about logistics. I understood that even then. I told my father I wasn't moving the date. He said he hoped I would reconsider. I said I wouldn't. Over the next few weeks, my mother called me 4 times. Each call followed the same pattern. She would start warm, ask about wedding planning, and then slowly, gently, work her way toward the same destination. Couldn't we look at late October? What about early June? Just something that worked for everyone? I told her each time that the venue was booked, the vendors were contracted, and that Natalie was an adult who had booked a vacation knowing my wedding date because I had shared it with the entire family the week we confirmed it. My mother's response to that last point was always the same. She had already put a deposit down before you announced. I checked my messages. I had texted the date to the family group chat on November 3rd. Natalie's trip, according to my mother, had been booked in late October or early November. The timeline was conveniently vague. I stopped pushing on it because I realized it didn't actually matter. Even if Natalie had booked first, she could have spoken to me. She never did. She never once called me herself during this entire period. Daniel watched all of this with increasing concern. He is a quiet person. He doesn't escalate, doesn't perform anger. But one evening in January, about 2 months after the date conflict had started, he sat down across from me at the kitchen table and said, "I need you to tell me honestly, how likely is it that your parents actually come to this wedding?" I told him I didn't know. He nodded slowly and said, "Okay, then I think we need to plan accordingly." That conversation changed how I approached everything that followed. We did not move the date. We continued planning. We hired a photographer, a caterer, a florist. We did tastings and sent invitations. We had a small engagement party in February with friends and Daniel's family, and it was genuinely lovely. My parents did not come to that either, citing a prior commitment that was never fully explained. Natalie sent a gift card. In April, my mother told me that she and my father had decided they would not attend the wedding unless the date was changed. I asked her if she understood what she was saying. She said she did. She said they loved me, but they couldn't choose between their daughters. I told her that she and my father had already made a choice. They just didn't like what it revealed about them. She cried. I stayed on the phone with her for another 20 minutes, which I regret, because I spent most of it trying to comfort her over a decision she had made. That is the thing about growing up as the difficult child in a family like mine. You spend so long managing other people's emotions about their own behavior that it becomes automatic. I told Daniel that evening. He listened, didn't say anything for a while, and then said, "Do you want to talk to a lawyer?" I didn't understand at first why he was bringing that up. He explained. When my grandparents on my mother's side had passed away, my grandfather in 2019, my grandmother in 2021, they had left behind a small estate. Nothing dramatic by any standard. A paid-off house in Cambridge that was sold. Some savings, some investments. The estate had been divided between their 2 adult children, my mother and my uncle, Robert. My mother's share, according to what she had always told me and Natalie growing up, would eventually be split between us, set aside as a form of inheritance. There was no formal trust structure, no lawyer involved, just a family understanding that my mother treated as settled fact. Daniel had been thinking about this. He asked whether, given how things were unfolding, I had any documentation of this arrangement, any emails, anything in writing. I didn't. Nobody had thought to ask for any. He said, gently, that might be worth addressing. In May, I reached out to my uncle Robert. He and I had always had a good relationship. He was the quieter, more practical branch of my mother's family. I asked him, carefully, whether he knew anything about how my mother's inheritance was being managed. He paused for a long time. Then he said, "How much do you know?" What he told me over the next hour reshaped everything. My mother had never actually set aside a separate portion for me and Natalie in any formal way. The money was sitting in my parents' joint accounts, an investment portfolio, completely commingled with their own finances. More significantly, my uncle had recently learned that my parents had made a substantial transfer to Natalie the previous year, roughly $34,000 described internally as an advance on her share. This had paid for, among other things, Natalie's Portugal and Spain trip. The trip that my wedding date was being asked to accommodate had been funded by money that was supposed to be split between us. I sat with that for about 4 days before I did anything. Daniel knew something had shifted in me, but he didn't push. He made dinner, checked in quietly, let me think. On the 5th day, I called a lawyer. Her name was Miss Okafor, and she practiced family and estate law in Toronto. I explained the situation. She listened carefully, and then told me what I needed to understand, because there was no formal trust, no written agreement, and no documentation of the intended split. I had limited legal standing to demand anything. However, she said, There were options. If I could get any acknowledgement in writing text messages, emails, anything, where my parents referenced the inheritance arrangement that would strengthen a potential claim. She also advised me to document everything going forward. I went home and spent an evening going through years of text messages and emails. I found more than I expected. My mother had texted me in 2020, after my grandmother's funeral, saying that she wanted me to know your share is being kept safe. We'd never leave you without something to build on. There were 2 emails from around the same period where my father had referenced what's set aside for both girls. It wasn't a contract, but it was something. I forwarded everything to Miss Okafor. Meanwhile, the wedding planning continued. We were now 4 months out. Everything was on track. I had accepted, quietly and fully, that my parents would not be there. It hurt. I won't pretend it didn't. But I had also stopped being surprised by it, which is a different kind of grief. Not sharp, just heavy. My aunt on Daniel's side, his mother's younger sister, had offered to walk with me for part of the ceremony, in a gesture that made me cry in her kitchen for about 10 minutes. My uncle Robert confirmed he would attend. I had good people. It was going to be a real wedding. Then, in July, I got a call from the venue coordinator. She was apologetic and confused. She said she had received a call from someone claiming to be my mother, asking about the cancellation policy for our booking. They had asked specifically whether the deposit was transferable, and whether the venue had any availability in June of the following year. No one had asked me about this. No one had told me they were making this call. I called my mother immediately. She didn't deny it. She said she was exploring options. She said she thought if the venue became unavailable, I might be more open to changing the date. I hung up. I called Miss Okafor the next morning. She sent a formal letter on my behalf to my parents within the week, outlining the financial arrangement history and requesting a written accounting of the inheritance funds, including the transfer made to Natalie. The letter was careful and measured. It didn't threaten anything. It simply made clear that the matter was being documented by legal counsel. My father called me 3 hours after receiving it. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had. He was not angry, which surprised me. He sounded tired. He said he didn't realize things had gotten to this point. I told him they had reached this point a long time ago, and I had simply stopped pretending otherwise. He asked if there was any way to fix things before the wedding. I told him the only thing I had ever asked was that they show up. He said he would talk to my mother. My mother did not call me. She texted me 3 days later. A long message about how she hoped I understood she was doing what she thought was best for the family, that she loved me, but that September 14th was still a problem, and they had already told people they wouldn't be attending. I read it twice, and did not respond. September 14th came on a Saturday, with clear skies and 22 degrees, which is about as good as Ontario gets. The vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake was exactly as beautiful as I had imagined it when we booked it 2 years earlier. The ceremony was held outdoors under a canopy of late-season vines, and the photographer later told me it was one of the most naturally lit weddings she'd shot all year. My uncle Robert walked me down the aisle. He held my arm like he'd been asked to do it 100 times before. He didn't make it weird or sad. He just walked beside me. The 2 front row seats reserved for my parents were empty. Everyone who was there could see them. Nobody said anything about them, which was the right call. Daniel's vows were not long. He is not a man who performs emotion, which is one of the things I love about him. But at one point he said, "I have watched you build something real out of nothing, more than once, and I don't think you realize that most people can't do that." He wasn't talking about the wedding. He was talking about everything. I understood it, and so did everyone else in the room, because there was a long quiet after he said it that wasn't awkward at all. We danced. We ate. We had a croquembouche instead of a traditional cake, which some of our older guests had never seen before, and became the subject of conversation for most of the evening. My Uncle Robert gave a toast that was funny and warm, and did not mention my parents once, which took skill. Daniel's family was generous and kind, and treated me like I was already someone they had known for years. At some point late in the evening, I stood on the terrace by myself for a few minutes. Not out of sadness. More like taking stock. I had planned this event for nearly 2 years. I had held the date through pressure and guilt and a formal legal letter. It had happened. It was beautiful. My parents weren't there and the wedding had been beautiful anyway, which told me something I had probably already known. 3 weeks after the wedding, Miss Okafor informed me that my parents had responded to the formal request with a written accounting. The documentation confirmed the $34,000 transfer to Natalie. It also confirmed that the remainder of what my grandparents had left after that advance was approximately $41,000, which my parents acknowledged had been informally designated for me. There was a mediation meeting in October. Daniel came with me. Miss Okafor was present. My parents brought their own advisor, an accountant they had worked with for years, not a lawyer. I want to be honest. It was not a dramatic scene. It was 2 hours in a neutral boardroom in downtown Toronto, with a mediator walking through numbers and documentation. My father, to his credit, didn't fight the core of it. He acknowledged the transfer to Natalie. He acknowledged the texts and emails that referenced my share. The final agreed outcome was that I would receive $41,000, paid over 6 months, representing my portion of the inheritance. There were no additional penalties. Just the settlement. Natalie was not in that room. She sent me a text the night before, saying she hoped things could be worked out without it getting worse. I did not respond. My mother cried at the end of the mediation, which I had anticipated. I felt something watching her, but it wasn't what I expected. It wasn't satisfaction or anger. It was mostly just tiredness. I had been managing this family's emotional weather for so long that sitting in a boardroom while a neutral mediator did it for me felt, genuinely, like relief. Daniel and I drove back to Toronto in mostly quiet. At one point he said, "How are you doing?" I thought about it for a minute and said I was okay. He nodded and turned the music up slightly, which is his version of saying he believed me. I received the first payment in November. Daniel and I used part of it as a down payment contribution toward a condominium we had been looking at in the East End of Toronto. We moved in the following spring. It was a 1-bedroom, with a second room we eventually converted into an office, and then into something else, which I'll get to. In December, my father texted me, asking if we could have dinner as a family over the holidays. I told him I needed more time. He said he understood. I don't know yet whether that's true. My mother hasn't reached out directly since the mediation. Natalie texted me happy birthday in February. I said thank you. My uncle Robert came to our housewarming. He brought a good bottle of Ontario Red and stayed for 3 hours, and we talked about everything except my parents. Before he left, he hugged me and said, "You handled everything exactly right." I don't know if that's completely true, but it meant something coming from him. What I know is this. I held a date. I kept a promise I made to Daniel and to myself. I stood in a vineyard under clear September skies and married the person I chose, in the place we chose, on the day we chose. And when the people who were supposed to love me most couldn't extend me the basic courtesy of showing up, I didn't collapse. I didn't beg. I didn't rebook. I just got married without them. The settlement helped, practically. But that's not why any of this mattered. It mattered because at every single point where I could have given in, moved the date, softened the boundary, traded my own plans for the comfort of keeping the peace I didn't. And the wedding was exactly what we wanted it to be. If you're somewhere in the middle of a situation like this, still trying to decide whether holding your ground is worth what it costs, here is what I can tell you from the other side. The people who needed you to fold are counting on the fact that you're not sure yet. Once you're sure, the whole equation changes. I was sure on September 14th, standing at the top of that staircase, looking at my uncle's arm, and the aisle ahead, and the empty chairs in the front row. And I walked forward anyway.